The session is hosted by Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation, which funds research into conservation, biodiversity, ecosystems. So what does that mean? When we read, for example, that the COP president disputes the science around phasing out fossil fuels, people will go and look for the scientists who have the evidence, and similarly with conservation, if somebody says this is the way that you deal with carbon sinks or biodiversity on rangelands, Oppenheimer Generations has scientific research that they can point to that says, well, this might inform the way that you should proceed on this, that, or the other conservation issue. We're following on from the very exciting presentation on the implementation of the just energy transition earlier by Minister Creasy. So I'm sure we're all still buzzing from that. This will be a slightly more micro presentation than the big sweeping one. So if I can just introduce the two panelists we have. On my left is Odrelwe Selomane. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Pretoria. He's an agricultural economist by training. His areas of research are into ecosystem services, so obviously critical here, socio-ecological systems, sustainable development, and ecological economics. And next to him is Deepak Patel, who's on the Presidential Climate Commission, where he's head of climate finance and innovation. He's a chemical engineer by training, I understand, and has rushed from one meeting to another, to another, to another. So I'm sure his head's spinning, and I hope he can calm it down sufficiently to give us some wisdom here. So to get into the subject of the panel, we kick off with the risk assessment from the World Economic Forum 2023 risk assessment, which identifies top 4 risks coming from climate change and biodiversity loss. No big surprise there. And the question is, well, from a financing point, how does one engage with that? Where does the private sector come in? What are the limitations? Is this the best approach? And I think it's great that we've got people from both government and academics here to talk to it. So let's kick off with Odie. Odie, do you want to talk about the problem, the risks, and some of the mechanisms and innovations that might be used to engage with the question of biodiversity loss?
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. So maybe to start by saying that when we talk about the environment there, we're talking about both climate change as well as biodiversity loss. So both those components form what we refer to as the environment there. And I think a report from maybe 2 years ago now from IPCC on climate change was really making a strong case for why these two things should be considered together rather than as two individual points to be chased. Now, with respect to the risks that we are talking about in the sector, there's several risks that one can talk to. This thing one of them is linked to exposure to capital. So if you think about investing in sectors that are at high risk of climate change and biodiversity loss, the risk of securing that capital that's invested there is increased as the impact of these two environmental phenomenon act on those sectors. For example, you can think about specific sectors such as agricultural sector, which is of course a big sector if you think about countries like Africa, etc. But you can also think about the insurance sector, where increases of environmental damage are also causing increases in claims. So the underwriting of the insurance itself is something that also becomes at risk in that sense. The other risk is coming from inputs into the sector. So if you think about, as an example, businesses that are using, let's say, water as an input, if you are seeing more and more of your catchments drying up, that has a direct consequence for the inputs that they're using in there. So these are some of the examples of the risks that you can talk about. There's of course way more. Some of them that are less material. So you're talking about reputational risks. You're talking about liability risks. You're talking about risks that are about how the society is reacting to to business. But here I'm really just focusing on the ones that are directly affecting the balance sheet, so to speak. So the problem that we have at hand and why the sector needs to come to play into the conversation is essentially twofold. One is that a lot of the investments that are being made into various sectors are either nature negative, if you like. So you have a small part that's nature positive, but a big part of it is nature negative or nature eroding. What that does, in addition to the finance gap that you already have, is that it's taking, you have a competition for the investments you're making into biodiversity, into climate change, coming from a much larger investment in sectors that are competing directly with that investment. The other side of it, is, of course, is that the finance itself is not enough. So we have the public sector financing from government allocation that is, in most cases, very strapped in terms of the cash, essentially. You have a leak in terms of taxes, and then you have another leak in terms of, I think this was mentioned even in the previous session, which is linked to debt, that you're allocating a big part of the finances that country to debt. So that's one aspect of that. In terms of the international public financing, at the moment, we've just completed an analysis that's not yet published. But essentially what it's showing that is that if you look at country to country, or basically patterns of investment within countries and across countries, what you're seeing is that internally countries are doing a fairly good job of prioritizing nature positive investments. But when they send money abroad, they're starting to, that pattern looks different. So the priority is going to nature negative rather than nature positive. And so in that sense, the conversation with the private sector is both to close the financing gap, as well as to close the nature negative investment, to reduce the nature negative investment, which is working against these investments that you're making. Yeah, I think I'll stop here.
Thanks, Odi. I think we'll just move straight on to Deepak. Deepak, obviously, when you're talking about what is the private sector role, private sector, we know, likes risk when it can get some profit from it. It operates within a particular framework, governmental framework, and I think as much as people look to business, they look to government for how does that framework of incentivization, security, prospects look, and how is it set up? What are the pitfalls that might emerge in trying to get sort of independent financing for various projects? So over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to start perhaps at the highest level of where the existential threats to human existence as we know it sit, where they stem from, and what the interrelatedness is between those things. Not so long ago, when people talked about global warming, it was a theoretical concept. But in the last 2 to 3 years, with the kind of work that literally thousands of scientists under the IPCC have done, have now started showing us that these are not just normal sort of every century or millennia based changes to the climate that we're seeing, but that it's human induced. And I think our starting point is that all of the crises, interrelated as they are in fact human induced. When we talk about human induced crisis, we can't run away from the fact that we have a particular global order that over the last 100 years in particular have seen a depletion of all natural resources, as well as an acceleration of pollutants, greenhouse gases, and more of concern is CO2 into the atmosphere. So as much as we want to start a virtuous cycle of addressing these things, let me posit that at the heart of this is not the continued well-being of the planet, but the continued preservation of what scientists are calling our planetary boundaries that form the boundaries within which human existence, social, economic, cultural, traditional, all need to be in balance for us to continue life the way we know it. Now, before jumping into finance, which is a very sort of difficult matter as it relates to how to finance biodiversity rehabilitation, biodiversity extension, biodiversity preservation. Let me say that unless we link this to the overall goal of responding as humanity to the multiple crises that we face, we run the risk of perpetuating the notion that biodiversity, its preservation, its extension, and its well-being is the preserve of environmentalists. So that's the first sort of point I want to make, and I think there's now a fairly generalized acceptance that saving the whales alone as a campaign is not going to work, hugging a tree in your individual right is not going to work, that holding multinationals responsible and accountable not only for their historical pollution and emissions, but also holding them accountable in a quantifiable way for what they continue to produce, either as pollutants, greenhouse gas emissions, or in the worst case scenario at the front line of multinational and domestic industries that continue to plunder nature because their business operating models rely on such plunder. So let's begin there and try to understand where the risks sit as we continue along this path that we now know is inevitable, but which we want to either slow down or hopefully reverse. And that is balance sheet. Now, there are specific sectors that have come to rely on their profitability on natural resources. Now, natural resources could stretch from South Africa, in South Africa's case, from continued mining and burning of coal to continued overfishing of our oceans to continued polluting through chemical and industrial processes our rivers. Now, a starting point, in my opinion, would be to identify those culprits. And I have friends in some of the culprits, so hopefully in a smiling way they'll forgive me. In this room, by the way. And it's so important to understand and accept that given the existential crisis that we face, we all have to come to the party. Now, we are only beginning in recent times to understand what the individual balance sheet implications are of highly emitting industries, sectors, as well as individual companies that have an impact in an outsized kind of way. And we're now beginning to count the costs of doing business as usual. And I would posit that the first port of call for insisting that biodiversity extension, preservation, and rehabilitation must be sitting on the plans, the transitional plans of those who are in the front line, as I said earlier, of relying on biodiversity loss and extraction of minerals and other material. More recently, the SARB has done some very interesting work, because through the prudential authority that regulates banks, what they're finding is that we've failed to count not only the historical costs associated with the profits that get generated from commercial balance sheets, lending books, investments, but that these are actually at risk if they do not start factoring in what the future costs associated with some of those risks are if they materialize. In my opinion, it is not a case of if they materialize, it is when they materialize. And when they materialize, even the IMF is now doing work to look at whether, in fact, biodiversity loss, climate change, together with further further causing the kind of wealth and climate and inequality gaps in the world can together result in unanticipatable events of financial crisis. And so let me say that we need to mainstream the conversation, unfortunately, from being good to the environment to beginning to get people to understand that embedded in all of our business operating models, in our existing income statements, and more importantly, in our collective balance sheets, is sitting a huge risk which no one has been able to quantify effectively. And I would posit that we start small, just as we do for just transition projects in the case of the just energy transition. Very difficult because it sits outside of the paradigm that business, the financial sector, the financial system, in fact, understand. And we begin advocacy, yes, continuing to cry for the saving of whales, but more importantly, advocacy that becomes smarter, that becomes much more tailored and therefore pinpointed to being able to identify where the risk spots are, where the financial crises might sit in terms of their source, and beginning to persuade those who plan in advance that they need to start fundamentally changing the way in which they operate, and they need to fundamentally pay attention to their externalities. I'll stop there, and I hope that in the course of conversation we can unpack some of these issues a little more in detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Deepak. That was a very good summary. And I think what one realizes, I think in all the various sessions, and I presume in all the negotiations, is exactly the intricacy of what one's dealing with. One is dealing with a social and natural ecosystem, and the interplay between those has certain implications. And I think the question of a full costing of running a business, a full accounting of profits, would change the picture quite fundamentally, and I think it would put a lot of people out of business if a full costing was done. So in other words, if one, how does one look across the board, not just at this business or that business, but how do you look at an ecosystem in which all these factors come into play? But to go back to Odi, I mean, one of the we've heard about the sort of big global picture, the macro country level. When you're talking about a specific, let's talk about a specific ecosystem which has a specific biodiversity quantum, and that quantum then is used in some manner by a business or another. Maybe you could cite from your research a particular case study which then links us with the business, the biodiversity, the money and the funding to actually get the whole system functioning in a way where it's not going to run out, and obviously that's a whole chain of factors. Yep. So maybe if you can draw from your research on that. And then obviously we need to get into the financing issue, because that's what this session is about. So what do we mean by financing? Where does it come from? What is it going to do? Is it sustainable to look at the type of financing mechanisms that you might be envisaging?
Yeah. So, but I first want to start by replying to something that Deepak said, which I think referring to environment as caring about the whales. And this is important to address because I think the conversation has moved quite a long way from there. So I think some of the earliest reports that really make this point very clear on a global scale was the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005, where they were essentially explaining the different ways that all human development essentially is underpinned by environment in different ways. So at the time they called this concept ecosystem services. And what ecosystem services then looks at has got basically 4 components that they were talking about at the time. One is the supporting services of nature. And here we're talking about basically the fundamental production of biomass in the world that is underpinning habitats and species and all the sort of the fundamental biodiversity. From there, the functions of these are now leading to 3 more direct links to human activity. So they talk about the provisioning services. And here we're talking about the provision of water, the provision of food, the provision of basic materials that we use both as things in households, but also as things as input in businesses, for example. And then there's the 2 other components. One is the regulating services. And this is looking at the regulatory function of nature, for example, for climate, to protect us to regulate the climate cycles. We're talking about the hydrological cycles that are regulating the water cycles. We're also talking about so things like wetlands, for example, that have a regulatory function of extracting nutrients from agriculture in a way that water that comes from on the other end is less toxic than it is. And then finally, we have the cultural services that are especially speaking about recreation, so the non-extractive uses of nature. So recreation, education, rituals, and a whole bunch of other things that you can talk about in that basket. And more recently, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service, IPBES, is using nature's contributions to people to really expand this idea that we are concerned about biodiversity not only for its sake, which is of course also a goal in its own right, but also for this provision of a set of services that are flowing into businesses, that are flowing into households, that are flowing into national balance sheets and things like that. So just to make that point clear, that at least that's what I'm talking about when I talk about this. Now,
sorry, can I just interrupt?
Sure.
With a bit of an embarrassing observation? Are you Olivia? Yes. Okay. To explain that, I had not met, I'm the moderator, and I was dragged in at the last minute, and I had not met Deepak or Olivia before this, so I have to ask a very stupid question, in which case I have to introduce you. I'm sorry that I've been neglecting you over there. So, Olivia Adiambo, she is with Wildlife Works Kenya, where she's the Climate Policy Director, I understand, and their business is finding finances which are channeled into forestry communities,
yes.
and we were hoping to hear from her about her work and how that's going.
Yep.
So I wonder, since the other two have had their moment, if you could possibly just give us a summary of what you do.
Thank you so much, and apologies for my late arrival. Let me start by saying I'm very excited to be in this conversation. Because the conversation is really about how finances or how the financial sector is driving environmental solutions, as opposed to previously when we were looking at financial sector as a driver of environmental degradation. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm sure the discussions have been quite rich. As you said, I work for a company known as Wildlife Works. We are a company that is community-centered and focused on forest conservation, and we use market-based solutions to enhance forest conservation. We are based in Kenya and in the DRC, and one of the tools that we've been using is what we know as the REDD+. REDD+ stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. If I could just talk a bit about REDD+ and how it has transformed communities in a small county in Kenya known as Taita Taveta. So REDD+ is a tool that looks at, first of all, it tries to understand the drivers of deforestation. So we have to understand that communities directly depend on forest and forest resources for their daily livelihoods. So whether we want to admit it or not, communities will always go and harvest resources from forests and any other natural resource for that matter. So REDD+ starts by interrogating what are the drivers of deforestation and what is the baseline of deforestation, and uses that as a basis for starting to create some change. And by this I mean, once you have understood the baseline and the business as usual scenario, that means if nothing is done, what is the graph likely to look like? So then the interventions start based on the drivers. So if the main driver is charcoal production, are there alternative sources of energy that communities can rely on? If the main driver is harvesting forest resources for economic use, are there alternative economic resources that communities can rely on for their income? Then again, you look at the communal needs such as education, you look at health, you look at water. And a company such as Wildlife Works invests in those and then monitors the changes in deforestation. And obviously, once communities start seeing benefits outside of the forest, they're able to take their children to school, they're able to access medical help, the women are able to access water from nearby water points, they're able to have alternative sources of fuel. Then you find that the need or the pressure on the forest reduces, and then we use certain scientific calculation to calculate the carbon stock that has been stored over that period, and we obviously now trade that in the voluntary carbon markets. Within the policy framework, the carbon conversations are progressing in Article 6. So in Article 6.2, there is discussion about bilateral carbon, not voluntary, but compliance market and country-to-country sort of trade. And then 6.4 looks at transitioning of what we used to know as the CDM into what is currently going on, which is Article 6 and the Paris Agreement, because CDM has been phased out by the Paris Agreement. And then there's 6.8, which has not really taken shape. But beyond also the climate negotiations, we have the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And last year, the 96 parties to the CBD agreed on a framework, which is the Global Biodiversity Framework. And there's a general consensus that biodiversity loss is one of the key threats that the globe is facing. And so there's need for countries to come together to address biodiversity loss. And within that, there are commitments by private sector, commitments by government to ensure that we are addressing biodiversity loss. So our work is anchored on those two international policies, but also at the national level, of course, we have to be aligned to the forest frameworks and the forest laws, and we have to also be aligned to the sub-national frameworks in terms of sustainable development. Yeah.
Is the business of the company carbon trade? What is the business of the company?
Yeah, so Wildlife Works is a company. It's a for-profit company that uses market-based solutions to enhance conservation. So we do trade in carbon, and really without including communities in that process, then our companies would not be sustainable. So community is a major component of how our business works, because together with the community, we conserve forests, and we ensure that there's enough carbon stock that can actually be traded in the voluntary carbon market.
I'm sure that's an enviable model that should be replicated. Back to you, Odi. You were interrupted you midstream, so perhaps if you can pick up there again.
Yeah, so you're asking, if I now remember, a question about an example of how
Yes.
we can go, basically a value chain of events that might lead from biodiversity to velocity.
We've had a little bit of an outline there from Olivia's presentation.
Right.
Thank you.
So this is an example from a few years ago now. We were working in a catchment area in the southern part of South Africa. And essentially the conversation there was around restoring this catchment to restore hydrological flow. And the big issue there for us, I was working in an NGO at the time, was to restore the vegetation in the landscape so that we slow down water through the rainy season, that it becomes available in the off-season. So essentially how, for the benefit of people who might not know this, is that when you have, during the high rainfall season, you get a lot of water coming into the catchment, and because we have dammed all our rivers in South Africa, then what happens is that all of that goes over the dam and you lose it, or you lose it, so to speak. It goes to the sea. And this model we're proposing was to revegetate the slopes, in this case, in the way that it slows down the water and it recharges the groundwater, and that becomes available as base flow during the off-season, when it's not raining. So that was the case we're making there. And
But the question was that you had a downstream user, a motor manufacturer. So you had a social use of water, and you had a...
I'm getting there.
Okay, right, yeah.
So I just wanted to explain the background story of why this matters. And so the conversation at the time to fix this problem from both the government and also the private sector was to invest in building a bigger dam wall, which... For them, it made sense that we can keep more water in the reservoir. But of course, you are losing a lot of things. But this might sidetrack the story. But maybe quickly to say, the sort of things you're losing is that by building the dam wall, you're pushing back the reservoir, and that's taking out campsites and basically disrupting tourism upstream. But downstream, what the issue was that all the downstream users who depend on this water as inputs were not convinced about this model. So we had to set up a lot of experiments first to show that essentially you are actually improving your soil moisture content over time and your base flow. But ultimately what this ended up being the case is that based on this sort of model and the results we're producing from the research, we managed to get companies downstream. So we went first to go to the motor industry. So this, the city downstream is Port Elizabeth in South Africa, and there's a massive motor industry there, but also other industries. So we were making the case for this model to them. And ultimately we ended up getting investments in catchment restoration as a safeguard for their own input. So they weren't doing it necessarily for the good of biodiversity or for the good of some grasslands or for the good of... they were
self-interest is a great motivator.
Exactly. So, I mean, this is one particular example of the motivation in this case being safeguarding your own input, but you can also do it for other reasons. Yeah.
Great.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
You have to allow me to defend myself.
Very briefly, because we are running out of time, and I'll
very briefly. I
floor.
Did not want to make fun of the Save the Whales campaign. I think OD has latched onto something that we need to start learning to do better, that we're not very good at. We're very good at projecting in a way that absorbs future cost at a future time, whereas issues related to ecosystem services like catchment investment upfront that preserves water rather than deals with it in a wasteful way, hugely important. But we're not very good, Odi, at making a convincing case for what the savings down the line would be of the rand invested today. And that then speaks to a more general point I was trying to make when I spoke about the whales, and that is the value chain through which we have learned to be wasteful needs to be revisited. And we need to redefine the way in which we count the costs of investment that are made today with respect to the future benefits, and not just in an overarching philosophical or we need to reconfigure the way in which we do our project management calculations through the life cycle of a rand invested today rather than assumed to be a cost in 20 years' time. The second point is that we need to locate our economic opportunities and the market opportunities in the context of the environments that we live in. And in this case, South Africa is water scarce, so it makes logical sense to focus on that. The other area in South Africa that makes absolute sense to focus on is, in fact, the rehabilitation of spent mining areas, in particular coal mining areas of Mpumalanga, because as the coal mines go into a phase of decline, that land, as it stands now, is not really usable for any productive means. So we need to start conceptualizing of alternative value chains that emerge in what we would call the brown environmental opportunity areas of the country. Finally, I think we're also talking about biodiversity from the point of view of what a country's natural endowment might be. And we know that in South Africa's case, we have preservation areas that are really relatively well maintained. However, the critical issue there is to find a better utilization of those areas, whether they be the national parks, whether they be the diving spots off the coast, especially on the East Coast, and start finding ways in which to articulate as well as package new environmentally based economic opportunities for jobs, for livelihoods, and bring the nexus closer than it exists at the moment between the people development question and the development and preservation of our natural resources.
Yes, I think it's important, one of the early points you made, that we are dealing with a matrix. So to separate out the categories that this is an environmental issue, that is an economic issue, that is a social issue, that thinking, and I get the feeling that a lot of work is being done in bringing that, in changing that thinking and bringing those different elements into the same discussion rather than to adversarial discussions. Olivia, do you want to make a final contribution before I open to the floor?
I think it is it's important to think about scalability and replicability. For a RED Plus project to be successful, you need not less than 250,000 hectares of land or forest. It could be pre-existing, it could be a forest that is regenerating. So in terms of scale, those are the numbers we're thinking about. And of course, we are open to talk to anybody who has that kind of a land available. Yeah.
That's a lot of land. Right. Is there anybody who wants to direct a question to any of our panelists? There's a microphone there.
I'm happy for anyone to take this one. How far along are we in looking at real ways in which we can classify nature as an asset? Because that would help a lot with the quantification, the valuation, and then the being able to work with that, right? Are there any interesting things you can maybe point us to that will help in that? I think, if I think about it, like, for example, financial services is one of the big growth trajectories in the country, in South Africa, for example, from an economic point of view. So if we look at the valuation of nature as an asset, it allows for some players like within financial services, I think, to start thinking about that differently and hence for the money to flow differently.
Anybody want to pick up on that?
Yeah, so there's several things. Is this working?
Yep, it's working.
So there's several things that have happened in the past already that are getting at this from different perspectives. So, for example, for the South African National Biodiversity Institute, SANBI, they've done a lot of work with this ecological infrastructure framing. And the main message there was to frame nature or ecology as an equivalent contributor to when you have the conversation about infrastructure. And following from that, they've done quite a few national ecosystem accounts. The framework that underpins the national capital accounting is inspired by the same framework that you use to basically develop GDP. So basically, what they're doing there is there's a really effective framework that's developed to collect all sorts of information at different corners of different scales that get aggregated into gross domestic product. What they're trying to do is a similar mechanism that is aggregating information about nature, the state of nature, especially the extent and the quality, in a way that you can get a signal that tells you whether you're doing well or not with respect to your natural resources. So that's the first step. And the second step from there, which they're not particularly keen on doing, but it's something that at least the methodologies and the tools exist to do ecosystem services valuation. There's heaps of literature and tools that exist that other countries have started experimenting on, where you could start putting monetary or economic value on ecosystems. It's very controversial. Lots of people see this as commodifying nature, and that can be, once it's commodified, it can be sold off to anyone. So that then perpetuates those inequalities we're talking about. So what is the just transition in that space of once you commodify it, how much can you control where it goes? And then some other challenges are, I think, linked to what Deepak was saying about what is the cost today and what's the cost in the future. So a not so interesting economic discussion around this is around discounting. So so I don't know if this is going to be an interesting thing for you, but if you think about net present value of something in economics, is you're trying to say what is the value of this thing in the future. So when you're investing money today, you want to have some returns, and so a very obscure discussion in that sector has been around what discount rates do you use for nature. So some people are saying it has to be negative because the future costs are much higher for next generations. Some people are saying it should be, so the discussion is almost stalled about where and how to value nature in a way. But tools exist. There's some small interventions or implementations that are done, for example, in the carbon offsetting market, conversations. The Landscape Initiative in South Africa is doing, not only in South Africa, actually across the continent, they're doing some work on green bonds, where they're starting to, they have species-specific bonds, but they're also having discussions about landscape-specific bonds. So I think tools are emerging, instruments are emerging to be discussed, but of course there's lots of risks that one has to mitigate for in terms of how do you, once you lose this, are you able to account for where it goes in a way?
If I could add on to that, I think nature, if you could call it a commodity, I wouldn't call it a commodity, but if you could call it a commodity, is not like any other commodity. It is very diverse and it is very complex. And just to give you an example, in the forestry sector, we talk about primary productivity, then secondary productivity. So at primary productivity, you're looking at the seedlings, and there's a whole market and there's a whole value chain in that. And if you talk about the secondary productivity, that's when the trees are mature, you're harvesting timber, most likely harvesting honey from the beehives that are in the forest, you're harvesting the fruits, they're harvesting any other product that comes from a mature forest. So if you look at that sector in itself, there are quite a number of values that you can attach to just this one sector. So it is complex and it is very diverse. And to just give also another hint of how complex it is, I'll give an example of Kenya. So in Kenya we have 35,000 known recorded flora and fauna, animal and plant species recorded. So try to value those based on their current value and the unknown value that we still don't yet know. So it's not a straight line, it's not very easy to do, but what I've seen many companies or many institutions doing is that you take a specific value. If you want to value the water ecosystem or the timber that you get from the forest, then you use that to do like an economic analysis. Yeah.
Thanks, Olivia. Deepak, you've been very quiet.
We're almost out of time.
We are out of time.
But I think Shamila has latched onto something. If we are to find interested investors in particular things that who might be on the frontier of knowledge, as well as the ability to see what the impact is going to be of not addressing biodiversity loss, then Shamila's point is critical. And that is, we need to package this in a way, however complex it might be, that at least appeals to those parts of the investor community base that want to, but at the moment don't have the means or the understanding to be able to put their hard-working, let's just call it environmentally oriented dollars and rands into an investment type of vehicle that actually achieves these outcomes.
Thanks, Deepak. I'll take that as a concluding comment. Is there anyone who wants to ask one final question? In that case, I'd like to thank our panel, Audrey Silamane, Deepak Patel, and Olivia Adhiambo. Thanks, everyone, for your time, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.